Hello, this is Michael Hauser. Hope everybody's doing good. Thanks for joining our call. What I want to do today to talk to you about specifically is how to assess historic significance, and then show you some specific examples that I have about how to write good statements of significance, what we're kind of looking for. You know, some of this probably will be a refresh for some of you folks, but it's always good to sort of rethink about what the criteria is and why things get listed and how they get listed and things of that. So really, to assess historical significance, you kind of need to do two things, really. You need to be familiar with a community's history, and you need to be the knowledge expert as the consultant. Your job is to you know, figure out what's significant and what is not significant to the community that you're looking at. First thing you got to remember is that 50-year cutoff date. And so when we think about the National Register, right, properties that are more than 50 years old are typically those that could be eligible for a listing to the National Register, although there's always exceptions to that rule. But I also want you to think about when we first started the National Register program back in 1966, 1916 was the cutoff. That's the 50 years. And so all the stuff that you're seeing on the screen right now, none of that was considered eligible for the register. So if you think about the state capitol, hadn't hit 50, all the Art Deco buildings, not 50. There's a great letter in the file regarding the Mount Constitution Tower on Orcas Island, rejecting it for National Register listing. So what that means is we got to change our mindset all the time. And of course, we're up to 2020, and I'm no mathematician, but if you hit the 50, that gets us up to 1970. Yikes. So there's lots of new resources to think about and new ones that are going to be coming, turning of age soon as well. And so all of these kinds of things that we see on here are all eligible now. So some of these have been eligible for a long time, but we've kind of turned a blind eye to them. So I think a lot of people still frown about surveying ranch houses and split levels, but those things are way within the 50-year mark. And, you know, some of them built into the 1970s and 80s as well. What we really want to look at here is districts, buildings, structures, objects, and sites. Those are all things that can be listed, types of resources. So districts are collections of buildings, usually next to each other. Think about a neighborhood or a downtown commercial area, usually touching, although there is something called a discontiguous district, which is super complicated, and I haven't had too much success with listing of those, but it is a possibility. Those are when things are sort of like groups that are separated by long distances. Buildings are, you know, what we list normally. So things that create human shelter or activity structures of those that you can't usually use for human shelter. Things are things like bridges. Those are structures. There's objects. Usually things that are objects are movable that could be listed. So you could list a train or an airplane or a boat. And then the last thing is sites. You can also list a site on the register. Things that are no longer standing. Usually I like to think of like a battlefield site or homestead site or something like that as well. So those could be listed as well. Once you figure out kind of what site that you have, there's kind of three basic concepts that I wanted to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about integrity, context, and of course the specific National Register criteria that we're talking about. So the first one is really historic integrity, and in my mind, historic integrity is really one of the most important things to think about. It's the identity of a property that is noticeable by the physical characteristics that existed during the period in which it was significant. So what is still there? What's intact? What's not intact? And of course, to do that, you have to understand the history of architectural styles and build dates, and be familiar with what's original, what's not original at a glance. There's 7 aspects of integrity. location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And oddly enough, there is no magic number that says that you have to have all 7 to have good architectural integrity or high integrity. It really depends on the kind of resource that you're looking at, and perhaps which criteria that you're nominating something under can be important as well. So just as a reminder what those criteria are, so location, you know, we're not really crazy about things being moved, although as you can see from these historic photos, things do get moved historically. So there are things that are on the National Register that have been moved. That's important as well. The overall design concept, what's the plan, what's the form, what's the space, what's the structure of how things come together, what's the style, is also one of the integrity criteria. Is the setting, you know, do you have something like this at Mount Constitution where they've got a visitor center that's sitting on top of a mountain? Can't imagine what would happen if that building was moved somewhere else. That's really integral to the overall setting. And you know, a barn is also a typical sort of nature as well. You know, it's in the middle of a field or on a farmstead, and now what if all of a sudden the you know, it's sitting in a Walmart parking lot because Walmart's, you know, purchased all the property around it, so that would have an integrity of setting problem. Even though it might be intact architecturally, the setting would be shot. What's the materials itself? Can you decipher what the materials are? Are they intact? Do you have original T111 siding? Do you have a material that's simulated to look like something else? So the house in Vancouver here is one that has stone, or looks like stone. It's actually cast concrete made to look like stone. Are those original to the building or not? So understanding those things are important as well. And the workmanship, can you tell how a building was constructed just by looking at them? It's a little easier for things that are, you know, much older, where you can see the hand craftsmanship, if you will. But is it still there? So does the building have a good integrity of workmanship? What about the integrity of feeling? This is the one that always gets squirmy. What the heck does that mean? And it's really as easy as you might think that it is. It's when you walk into a space, do you feel like you're in a historic space? So this church is a good example of, you know, you can tell that you're in a turn of the century church versus if it had all new pews in it or something like that. You know, the feeling might be a little bit different, and you feel like it had a remodel at some point. So that would be in the integrity of feeling as you get to a certain time. And the association, what's the larger story behind your integrity piece? What's the link? Is it a courthouse? Is it associated with a fair property? Does it have a direct link that is still noticeable or discernible? Got a couple examples in here of buildings, resources that have maybe some integrity questions. This is a bridge up in Bering that was originally designed in 1912. However, the whole structure was replaced in 1958, and really subsequently most of the structure has also been replaced. So here's a couple photographs of new decking taking place and new railings. So the question is, does this resource have good integrity or not? And I would argue that it does have integrity. It may not have integrity of materials, but it still has integrity of location and design and setting and workmanship and that feeling and the association. In fact, this building, this bridge was recently listed on the National Register. So here's one where the physical materials can be changed, but still eligible for listing. In fact, it was listed. Here's another example of a old apartment building, you know, super cool Tudor revival or French chateau with its great little spiral staircase, which is you know, very intact with all that original tile on the entranceway. But if you walked around the rest of the building, it looks like this. It was converted into an office for group health in the 1950s. There are, however, several pieces that are left of the apartments still inside. So does it have good integrity or not? That was a question that we had to struggle with. I can tell you that this one is also listed on the National Register despite being some changes in the inside. So you still have the repetitive nature of where the rooms were. You can still see where the hallway spaces are. Obviously, the stairwell's intact. There's a couple original fireplaces left, but something to think about. I also want you to think about the condition of the property and the fact that the condition is not really a factor, actually. You could have a building like any of these where the condition, you know, it's rain's coming through, the siding needs to be replaced, the roof needs a paint job, that kind of thing. While these buildings may look in dire shape, they really do have a high level of integrity. All the materials are there, all the design features are there. It just needs some assistance to stand for another 100 years. This is what I kind of like to do when I'm thinking about the integrity, is really kind of ask myself these 4 basic questions. So, you know, really knowing just by looking at it from the street without doing any research, you know, is it 50 years old or not? What period of significance might we be talking about? Is it a resource that looks original to the way that it was constructed, or maybe it had a remodel? What are those character defining features of the particular age or style? Are they still there? Does it still retain those features, or have they been covered up, or have they been altered? That sort of thing. It's a quick assessment from the street, if you will. Remember, no research really. If it's less than 50, could it be exceptionally significant? Might be. I've been digging into the research of earth sheltered properties like this Blue Ridge Elementary School in Walla Walla. We certainly don't have any of these listed on the National Register at the moment, but earth sheltered properties show up in the 70s and 80s. So if you've got something like that out there that you stumble across, you know, definitely it would probably be recorded as this unusual piece. And then you got to figure out if it's significant or not. But thinking about the period of significance is also kind of an interesting concept to think about as well. And then probably the best example I can think of is Volunteer Park. So it was listed on the National Register for its Olmsted connection. It's this great park, has this standing water tower and a conservatory for plants. The period of significance for the park was from the time of construction, and then it ended, I believe in 1925. So subsequently, the later resources that were built in the park, i.e. specifically this great building in 1933, was considered a non-contributing property to the district. So it was a non-important to that context of the park, which is kind of odd to think about. Subsequently, the museum building itself has been listed individually on the National Register. I guess there was a couple different ways you could go about it, doing that. You could do an individual listing, or you could rewrite the original nomination to change the period of significance. That would be another way to think about listing of that resource or assessing its importance as well. Here's another great example. When you look at this building from the street, this is up in Bellingham, it looks like it's totally altered, right? It looks a mess. It's been stuccoed over the outside. It's got porches that have been enclosed. This is what it used to look like. So the historic photo at the bottom, 1902. However, the period of significance really goes up into the 1940s. And that's because of some deeper understanding about how this alteration happened, and the alteration itself being significance in and of itself. So Mrs. Axel was one of the first women to be elected to the state legislature. She was a pseudo architect, and when her husband passed away and she was down on money, she decided to convert her house into an apartment complex, and she did the design work to convert it. As good or bad as it may be, it's still important to that message about that. What about a building like this in a downtown area? Here's a historic photograph up at the top. It's got a curtain wall down at the bottom. This is downtown Tacoma. So curtain wall added in the 1950s. What do you do in that scenario? This is what it looks like now. So they took the curtain wall off. What was its spirit of significance? Was it more significant because of the original design? Was it significant because of the curtain wall? I'll let you decide. I think you could go either way. We've got a lot of historic districts now that have these later 1950s, 60s alterations, and we're starting to develop context that really makes those significant. Here's another example of a church. This is Mount Zion Baptist Church up in Seattle. The original complex, the original church has been demolished. Then later, an educational wing was built in 1963, and then the sanctuary came later in 1975. So what's the significance, the period of significance for this property? Is it the early church, and would you just write off this later design, or is it really the continuity of the history of the church complex itself and the growth and development of it through the years? This property was listed on the National Register as exceptional significance. It's all one building tied together. Hence one inventory form, if you will. So we wouldn't do a separate inventory form for the educational wing and a separate inventory form for the church. It would all be together because they're connected. Here's the educational wing and the original church. One of the reasons why this is significant is because of its connection to Reverend McKinney and Dr. Martin Luther King. McKinney was instrumental in getting King to come to Seattle, and he's really the main player who championed the civil rights movement in the city of Seattle. So a super important process, and the sanctuary is a reflection of that culture that McKinney wanted to sort of instill later in the 1970s. Do you understand the character defining features of a property as well? So, you got to know the architecture of the building. What's typical? What's common? Did they have those kinds of windows on geodesic domes? If I'm looking at a mobile home park, what kind of alterations might they have? Things of that nature. I want you to also think about looking at sorry here, I'm getting my next slide. If you don't know, there's lots of guidebooks out there to figure out things about the style. I've got some style guides on our website. I am more than happy to answer style questions or building form questions. There are no dumb questions. Just feel free to send me a quick photo and say, hey, Michael, what style do you think this is? That's what I'm here for. So don't be embarrassed. We've got a lot to learn. I've got a lot to learn myself, still educating myself, particularly on these post-World War II things as to what's significant and what's typical and when materials get introduced or not. So feel free to ask. Don't be embarrassed. We are here to help. And then you got to decide what's left, right? So if you know what should be there, well, what's left? How do you do that? You might just know based on the architecture of what should be there, or you could do some deeper research and find some historic photographs of what should be there or not. Maybe how storefronts were arranged originally, where the doors were or were not, or what the windows look like. So you might do some quick research that way is another way to know as well. A couple other examples for you. This is the Chambers block in downtown Olympia. When I looked at this building first, I thought, okay, yeah, obviously it had a remodel. However, it had this remodel in the 1940s after the earthquake of 48. It was really, kind of skimmed down to its bare bones. However, if you look at that, you'll see that there's now some dormers on the front of the building that got re-added after the fact. So this is what it looked like originally. So we've got today, 1948, what it looked like originally. So here's a case where somebody tried to bring back some of those character defining features. Whether it's successful or not is certainly debatable. So what kind of integrity does that building have? Building down the bottom, down in Edmonds, the Beeson building, you know, it looks pretty darn intact. All the windows are there, the parapets are there. Certainly the big addition is this crazy awning down front, which covers up all the transom windows. Is that enough to change the design and the integrity of the property? Something to think about. So this is always the big question. If something really doesn't have integrity, it's not going to be eligible because you have to have some level of integrity in order to balance, offset that significance, at least in the National Register world. I know there's been lots of discussion, particularly as we talk about things of the recent past and the significance of resources, and maybe downplaying the integrity level, but this is where we're at today, is that integrity piece is really the key to making things happen. Kim pointed out, I said those are dormers. You're right, they're not dormers. That's an awning, and that's a pent roof up at the top there. Thank you, Kimberly. All right, what about additions? How do you assess these additions on a building? What distinctive material is left from the original? Has the addition obscured the original architectural style, and do those additions, you know, really change the character of the building? So here's an example in the newspaper of a great little foursquare that has been, you know, simplified in the 1930s, and a current photograph of what it looks like today. So what's the story behind this? What is its level of significance? What's the period of significance? Is the alterations, are they significant of themselves, or are they not? A couple of examples for you. The top one on the left is the Civic Center in Seattle. That's the original photograph up on the top. And of course, during the fair of 1962, Century 21, the whole outside of the building was reskinned to make it match with a lot of the other structures. Nobody really considered this building very significant, unfortunately. And of course, it was demolished not too long ago, and lo and behold, they found the original facade underneath. That sort of raises the question of what was the period of significance for that facility. Think about that. The other one across the house here is the same house, and the top photo is the original photo, and then in the 1930s, it was colonialized down the bottom, stripped of all those sort of detail. Is that change in the colonialization part of the story? Certainly it is. Your job would be to figure out if it's significant or not. This is what it looks like today. So still looking like from the 1930s remodel. A couple other quick buildings to show you. Again, just sort of differences in integrity. Here's a house in Clay Elum with obviously a turn of the century, 1905 house that has a craftsman style porch on it. Same down below here, we've got a Victorian era cottage, and then it has this great, clinker brick chimney and wraparound porch. Obviously these were added later, but probably over 50 years ago. The Jones building in Walla Walla is a fun one to look at as well, because it's a massive remodel of an existing very ornate Italian age structure where they really just cut everything off and went to this modern streamlined international style look of the building. Does that make it not eligible because it doesn't look like this Italianate multi-bayed building anymore? And I would say no. Its period of significance has changed. It's really about this 50s remodel. Once you figure out what those remodels are, then you really need to think about the context. So what's the connection to the larger story? Does it tie in with a remodel story? Does it tie in with a development of a neighborhood, of a downtown area? Is it garnered around a theme? Is it garnered around a geographic location? Is it garnered around the architectural style or maybe an architect? There's lots of different ways that you can sort of bring historic contexts together and evaluate properties. And then you have to evaluate what the level of significance is. So for most properties that are significant, they're really significant at the local level of significance. So very few, I would say probably 90% of properties listed on the National Register of Washington State are listed at the local level of significance. Those that have national level of significance really could be national historic landmarks. So those are, super important buildings like Freeway Park in Seattle. Obviously has a national impact as the first, park that covered a freeway. So you got to think about the level of significance as well. Here's some geographic areas. A good example of a bridge along the line. So in this case, the whole line was determined eligible for the National Register. The railroad line all the way from Vancouver into Spokane. However, a multiple property nomination designated various bridges along the line to the National Register as individual listings. So there's a geographic period as well. Some other examples that you might think of about the property type and understanding the property types as well. Is this a good example of a BPA substation? Is it not? Does it look like all the rest of them? How does this courthouse fit into the courthouse design and construction of other courthouses across the state? Or how does it contribute to the local economy of Adams County? Lots of different ways that things can be important. A couple other examples here about their context, their associations, their architectural qualities. The bottom one in Walla Walla is a building that looks like any commercial building, maybe multi-use building, and this one truly had a multi-use building because it was acted as a stop on the local trolley line. You can just see in that back of that current photo down here is the entrance door for the freight room of the trolley house. And if we were to look behind the building, there's actually trolley tracks go into this building. So again, knowing the context, the history, that's super important. And then, if you know the context and the history, what's left? Is there enough left to tell the story? This is Port Blakely lumber mill, and there is really nothing left there today except some remnants of the one of the mill buildings, and of course all of these ties that are directly connected to shipping. Okay, so we got integrity. We've got context. Now we really need to talk about significance. And you can only really evaluate the significance of property if you know its context. So knowing that background, being a good historian and figuring out what the connection might be. This is an apartment building up in Bellingham that looks like a pretty ordinary apartment structure, but in fact it was tied directly to a FHA housing program, the FHA 608 housing program. So it's got this great story about what that program means and how it was developed. You might also have a property that must be significant because it represents a period in history, its architecture, its archaeology, its engineering. It must have the characteristics that make it important. So you really do need to understand the ins and outs of a property if you're looking at specific property types. So I want to talk specifically about the criteria because there does seem to be a lot of confusion about the criteria, particularly when it comes to evaluation in the historic property inventory forms. And we're asking folks that they evaluate all four criteria when they fill out the inventory forms. And so the criterion A is really the broad patterns of history. So what's the connection to the property? And I think, if you are a good historian, you can probably come up with a connection of anything that's connected to the broad patterns of history, whether it's residential development or commercial development or transportation history or religious history. The key in these kinds of situations is really going to be about the integrity level of the property. Has it changed or not? So most properties are going to be tied to an event, a specific event that is tied to a broad patterns of history. The second one are properties that are associated with important persons. This is probably going to be the most difficult one for you to evaluate in a reconnaissance survey because you're just not going to have the research that you need to figure out if a property is associated specifically with a person. In this sort of scenario, you have to prove that the property being nominated is the best property that's associated with an important person. So we've got the Sonora Smart Dodd House. She was the founder of Father's Day up in Spokane. So the connection is this was her house and how she was the main player who made Father's Day become a national holiday. Or you have somebody like Dr. John Phillips. He's just a doctor in the small little town of Newport. His office is gone. This is the only property that's left connected to him. Conrad Brutel. Here's a good property that's got some integrity issues. It originally had a wraparound porch on the building. That's been gone. However, this is the only property associated with Butel. He was an important businessman. He ran a business college in downtown Tacoma. That's also a National Register listed property. Most properties that are added to the National Register, the easy one to do is this criterion C, and that's really its architecture. And this is probably the one that most people misinterpret, if you will. Notice that it says that it embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. Doesn't say that it doesn't say anything about architectural style, for one thing, but it also doesn't say anything about being distinctive, just that it has to embody the distinctive characteristics. So a property doesn't have to be the only example, the best example. You just have to tell us, explain why it has the distinctive characteristics of its type, of its period of construction, of its method of construction. The second part of that is represents the work of a master. Who gets to decide who a master architect is? That's really for you to decide by understanding the individual's body of work. Does it represent he or she's work? Does it represent a certain time frame in their period? There is no master table that says, hey, this guy or gal is an important master and this one is not. I should let you know that I have files on about, I don't know, probably close to 2,000 architects who practice in Washington. So if you happen to stumble across a name, just shoot me off an email. Say, hey, Michael, what do you got? What do you got on this individual? And I'd be more happy to PDF you over the file, so you can add that to your knowledge. The last one piece of it is, or possesses high artistic values, or represents a significant and distinguishable entity whose components can lack individual distinction. That's really when we're talking about buildings that are connected to districts. So the overall assessment about how things together results in a significant entity whose components lack individual distinction, right? And the last one is criterion D, usually for things underground. Archaeology, it's not that, hey, we didn't do any research, so there may be some research there, i.e. the potential to yield. It's not that. It's what is in the ground may tell us some other things about our history, whether it's specific to archaeology or TCP, traditional cultural property, things of that nature. Generally, you may or may not address criterion D, but a building could have D characteristics as well. It's certainly a possibility. When you're looking at districts, because remember, there's two districts on the question. We're not asking folks to determine boundaries of the district, but we are asking you to use your knowledge when you're on the ground to say, hey, there looks like a lot of intact stuff around here. There might be a district here. And this building that I'm looking at might be contributing to that district. So it's that yes or no question, answering that on your form. So if you look at a house like this, bottom is a historic photograph. This is what it looks like today up on the top. Obviously it's been altered. Have those alterations changed the character of the property so it's non-contributing anymore? Think about that. And it's really a case-by-case basis. The example that I showed you, the Gold Coast Historic District, probably 95% of those properties in that district have a vinyl and aluminum siding. But as you can see, most of them were considered contributing properties. So it's a case-by-case basis depending on the character of an individual historic district. Something to think about as well. Also, when you're looking at districts, the boundaries really need to be based on kind of three things: the age, the significance, and the integrity. These are examples of a property that might be based on, this is a school boundary that we see here. So the school district owns the whole boundary, but the resources are really clumped at the beginning or at the bottom of the page there. So that was the official boundary that was put together. Oysterville, same way, you know, it's not the entire community, it's just really centered on the historic buildings that are there and those that have integrity as well. Think about that. The statement of significance that we're seeing, I think a lot of people got nervous about, hey, you know, DAHP is really asking for these big, entire, long histories, and we do not want you to do that. We want you to use your brain, use your knowledge that you have as the expert out there to pull stuff together. So these are kind of things that I want you to think about. You got to address all 4 criterias. You got to consider the date of construction. You know, who used to live there? What did they do? Maybe can you tell that just by the architecture of the building or where it's located in a particular community? I have some examples for you. These are real examples, but I have changed the context slightly to protect the innocent. So this structure is a small-scale irrigation facility that does not appear to meet any of the criteria for eligibility to the National Register of Historic Places. That was the statement of significance that was submitted. It's not a very good example, specifically because it doesn't talk about anything about integrity. It certainly doesn't talk about why it doesn't meet any of the criteria. Things of that nature. The next one is the example of modest 50s ranch house with some compromised integrity. Okay, what has been compromised? And tell us what the criteria is that you evaluated. Is a modest example okay? Under criterion C, a modest example could be okay. This could be just a good example of a classic 1950s ranch house, i.e. embodied the distinctive characteristics of its period of construction. This building is not recommended eligible for the National Register under criterion C because it lacks architectural distinction. That's always a red flag for us. That is not National Register criterion C. Doesn't have anything to do with distinction. The Hauser House is not directly associated with any important events under local, state, or national register criterion A and B. The residence is a typical example of craftsman, possesses no architectural characteristics. It is recommended not eligible. Well, that's pretty good, but you didn't tell us why it doesn't meet A or B. Another one that we see often as well as evaluating the presence of a district is beyond the scope of the study. It is not beyond the scope of your study. That is one of the questions that you have to answer. Just look around and see what's next door. You know, when you're driving into an area, walking into an area, does it appear that there's a district there or not? Pretty easy to figure out. This is also one that we see a lot, which is these large statement of significance that are these cut and paste jobs where we have resources that may have been built in 1950, but the period of significance starts in the 1850s. And we don't need to know that. We don't need to know what happened there 100 years ago. We really want you to get down to the brass tacks and tell us exactly why that particular resource. You can save all this background information for your report. It does not have to be within the HPI. Because when you think about it, as Holly is reviewing these, you know, we're opening up each individual one, and when you've got 6 paragraphs of stuff that doesn't relate specific to that resource or that's all cut and paste, it takes a long time to evaluate what is the real history of that resource. So don't send us those long cut and paste jobs. This one's a little bit better. This is reportedly the Borth residence was moved to a site in 1950. The house is being used for farm related. Its outhouse has a low level of integrity due to changes in the roof line, so it told us specifically. It also says it's in bad condition, and then it says it's been moved. The contexts have also been altered. It is recommended not eligible for the National Register. So a little bit better. Kind of talked about the integrity, but it didn't talk about the specific National Register criteria, or that the evaluator looked at the criteria or even knows what the criteria is. Here's one that's a little bit better. Olympia, a little background information here. Olympia is on the edge of the Puget Sound. Present day landscape in downtown Olympia as the subject of the building sits on fill. This building is eligible individually under criterion A for its connection to the growth and development of downtown Olympia. Great. It's also eligible under B for its connection to the Bean family. Obviously, they did some research. The building is designed by a noted architect, Joseph Wallab. Great. The building may be eligible as a contributing property in an unexplained previously listed National Register district. That last sentence is a red flag. We don't want to see anything that's maybe eligible. Your job as the consultant is to tell us whether things are eligible or not, in your opinion. Here is a good example of one that really pulls it all together based on the various criteria. Built in 1923, the home is eligible for listing. For its direct connection, talks about the various criteria, talks about specifically the characteristics that it has in those periods. It talks about alterations, so the integrity level there at the bottom, therefore is recommended eligible under A and C. So that would be a good example. Notice it doesn't have all the deep history there. I have a few more slides. Folks were wondering, well, what does one look like that's not eligible? Would you go over the criteria that's not eligible? And yes, the answer is yes, you should absolutely go over why you think it's not eligible. So this is, specifically due to alterations, the property does not possess its distinctive characteristics of its type or period of construction, is not known as connection to a master. No archaeology has been conducted on the site, is not likely to yield information. The dwelling has a low level of architectural integrity. While the location in the home setting is intact, other changes have occurred, including doors and windows, which differ in size and location. This is a good example of what a quick, down and dirty statement of significance is going to be. It talks about all four criteria. It talks about the integrity level. It gives a little bit of history as well. That's a good example. Some quick tips for you. I don't know if you noticed, we all have a dog theme. This is my dog Lulu. When you're doing these statements of significance, focus on what the resource, why the resource is significant. Stay on course. Don't get distracted by larger history of the community. Just tell us why that specific resource. You want to be clear and concise as possible. Don't use a lot of jargon. Use language that people, general public, know of. If you're quoting facts, make sure you follow it up by things that are in your bibliography. Stay on your topic. Show us that it's in the bibliography. Not all facts are significant. Not all facts have value. So length is, don't put it to the weight test. Brevity is good as long as it's got good data. Don't paste definitions of the National Register criteria. We know what the criteria is. That doesn't need to be in the nomination. Often, keep in mind that resources have multiple values. Consider all those when you're writing the statement of significance. And it is not always just the architecture. It may just be criterion A. Maybe it should be broad patterns of history, like those examples that I showed you. I also want you to don't forget about looking at the individually eligible as contributing. You got to answer those two questions. Know your history. That's your job. That's your task. If you don't know, ask somebody. Go to the local museum. Ask somebody else on your team. You can certainly search old inventories and context statements that have already been done for communities they might be doing research in. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. I'd say most communities have something already that's been written about them out there. Lots of guidebooks on how you do this out there. If you don't know, there's specific bulletins for certain resource types. You can certainly find those online through our website, or if you want to know more information, just shoot me off an email or give me a call. Don't forget about Wizard. We're here for technical assistance. And call me or email me. Remember, there's no dumb questions. We're here to help. We're here to help you get through the process and answer those questions in a timely manner, hopefully. Any questions out there, Kim or Nicholas or Holly? I saw a few kind of pop up here and there.
Yeah, Michael, if you check the chat box, there were a couple about criteria, or there was one about criteria A. You did talk about that in your presentation.
Yeah, I see one from Naomi. It says, what about criterion A when significance might not be about the architectural style? I'm not sure if I understand your question. Remember, criterion A is broad patterns of history. So when you're talking about style, It's usually criterion C, although C doesn't specifically state style in its criteria, but it's the period of construction or method of construction. So the period of construction might be the arts and crafts movement or the Victorian era. Broad patterns of history is more related to transportation history or educational history or residential development history, things of that nature, commercial development. I hope that answers your question, Naomi.
Naomi wrote back and said that she thinks that you covered that previously. So
excellent. I know it's a quick overview and it's a lot to consider.
And Michael Nick asks, what is your Snapchat handle?
historygeek.org. I don't have Snapchat. I'm not on Snapchat. Nicholas, come on. You can.
Michael, we do have. Oh, sorry,
Go ahead,
we
Ollie.
do have another question. If you add a resource, do you do an addendum to the existing nomination, and is there a form?
So if you're recording something that's maybe already in the National Register and it doesn't have an existing historic property form, you would create one for sure. We've been trying to get all the old National Register nominations to at least have some HPI points. But remember, as Kim told us, it's about recording properties at a period in time, right? So, getting that, maybe all the history's there that you need in an existing National Register nomination, but we would definitely want to know its level of integrity today and have current photographs, things like that. If you're talking specifically about doing a National Register nomination and amending a National Register nomination, certainly that is not a requirement by any stretch of the imagination. Hope that answers your question. I know it's a little bit confusing in terms of when you're dealing with federal agencies sometimes, because on the archaeology side, Dr. Whitlam, if you're dealing with the federal projects, likes to have National Register forms filled out for federal properties, federal archaeology pieces. That is not the case for the built environment. So we're just doing everything off of the historic property inventory forms. The National Register form would come into play as mitigation if that happens to be what's written in a MOA.
Hey, Michael, check the chat box. Naomi has additional question for you about National Register Bulletin 15.
Yeah, I just saw that pop up there as well. Yeah, I'm simplifying the 15, and I do have it totally reversed, and that's really based on my experience in getting things listed for the last 20 years. The integrity is the piece. I don't know if I should say this out loud, but I'll tell you anyways. I think you could really make a case for just about anything being eligible for the National Register if you've got the right crafted story. The key is always the integrity. So if something doesn't have integrity, you're never going to get around the story. So that's why I'm focusing in on the integrity piece as the most important piece. Good question.
Yes, and a lot more could be said about that as well if we had more time.
Yeah, that's for sure. There's lots of great examples of there that I can show you of things that do get listed because of their integrity or don't get listed because of their integrity. I'm always shocked at what gets listed sometimes in crafting those stories. It's about being a good writer often. But remember, for Section 106 purposes, we're not going into all that depth of analysis usually. It's just a street reconnaissance windshield level survey, and you don't have time to dig in deep. So doing the integrity analysis is really our way to get things done quickly.
I will just jump in here and say that I see that we're getting close to the bottom of the hour at this point, and I see people are drifting off. So so if there are any other questions or comments, the chat box is still open, of course. If you want to send in a chat box question, go ahead. In the meantime, I will make some closing remarks and thank yous. First of all, I want to thank our presenters, Holly and Kim and Michael, for your great presentations this morning and afternoon, and to thank Nick as well for managing the chat box and our technology with the GoToMeeting. Thanks very much to all of you. And again, thanks to all of our guests this morning for joining us. It's been great having you with us, and I hope that it was valuable and useful for all of you. Another reminder is that we will be Holly will be sending out to you an evaluation form or check sheet, and which we will be very interested in hearing and receiving your comments, thoughts, recommendations that you would have for us. And on that note, I will also mention that is certainly our hope and intent that we can continue with our DAHP Academy presentation.